The glass of red wine that's supposedly good for your heart has never once been proven to be good for your heart. I believed that line for about 10 years, mostly because it let me drink at family dinners and feel clever about it. Then I went looking for the original evidence, and it fell apart in an afternoon. I'll show you where that story came from and what actually happens in your body from the first sip. Stay to the end, because the no safe dose crowd oversells one part of this badly. In the late 80s, researchers noticed something odd about France. The French ate a mountain of butter, cheese, and duck fat, yet had lower rates of heart disease than Americans. Somebody had to explain that gap, and red wine was the most charming suspect on the table. An American news segment ran with it in the early 90s, and red wine sales jumped within months. That's the real birth of the health halo you've been carrying since school. It started with a TV segment, not an experiment. The research that came afterwards did seem to back it up. And that's the part that fooled me for years. Study after study found that people who drink a little live longer than people who drink nothing at all. It's the famous J-curve, and it looks airtight until you ask who's sitting in that non-drinking group. That group isn't full of healthy people making a healthy choice. It's stacked with former heavy drinkers who quit, people on medication that doesn't mix with alcohol, and people already too sick to drink. You're not comparing wine drinkers to healthy people, you're comparing them to a group preloaded with sick ones. The obvious fix is to find people who drink less for a reason that has nothing to do with their health. Genetics hands you exactly that. A large share of people carry a gene variant that makes alcohol feel physically awful, so they drink less without ever deciding to be healthy. Compare those people to everyone else, and the heart protective effect mostly evaporates, while blood pressure and stroke risk keep climbing with every extra drink. That's the cleanest natural experiment we have, and it points the other way. There was supposed to be a real trial to settle this. A few years back, the US National Institutes of Health launched a big study to test moderate drinking properly, and it got shut down before it produced anything. Most of the funding had been arranged through the alcohol industry, with researchers in contact with those companies while designing the study. So the one experiment that could have proved the wine story right died of embarrassment. Everything you hear quoted today still comes from the observational pile and that TV segment. Then there's the compound argument, the one your uncle deploys around the third glass. Red wine contains resveratrol and tannins, and those do genuinely interesting things to blood vessel cells in a dish. The problem is dose. The amounts that worked in animal studies are wildly higher than what sits in a glass of wine, to the point you'd need hundreds of bottles a day to match them. At that dose, the ethanol has opinions about your health that no tannin wins against. You can get the same compounds from grapes, berries, and olive oil without the designated driver. I want to be fair about why this myth is so sticky, because it isn't stupidity. It's a story that flatters us. It says the pleasant thing is also the smart thing, comes with a French accent, and gets repeated by doctors who heard it the same way you did. Once you like drinking, a scientific-sounding reason to keep going feels fantastic. I know, because I used it at every family table for a decade and said it with real confidence. Knowing where the story came from doesn't tell you what ethanol actually does once it's in your blood. That's the part nobody explains at dinner. Ethanol starts crossing into your blood while the drink is still in your mouth, because the tissue in your cheeks and under your tongue is loaded with vessels. Most of it clears through your stomach and small intestine within minutes, and from there, it doesn't route to one organ. It rides the blood everywhere, which is why the liver story we grew up with is only a slice of it. Your brain, heart muscle, gut lining, and pancreas all get the same delivery at the same time. Ethanol is a tiny molecule that dissolves in both water and fat, which is what makes it so good at getting into cells. It doesn't need a door or a receptor, it slips straight through the membrane of basically any cell it touches, and at higher concentrations it makes those membranes looser and sloppier. That's the mechanism people wave away when they say a little can't hurt. The amount decides how much of this happens, not whether it happens. Then your liver tries to clean it up, and the cleanup is where the real damage lives. An enzyme converts ethanol into acetaldehyde, which is far nastier than the alcohol it came from. It binds directly to your DNA and jams up the way cells copy themselves, which is exactly the kind of damage that turns into cancer years later. This is why the International Agency for Research on Cancer put alcohol in the same category as tobacco and asbestos, a fact almost nobody who drinks socially has heard. That category is about how strong the evidence is, not about a glass of wine and a lungful of asbestos being equally dangerous per exposure. It's a filing decision made decades ago that never made it into dinner conversation. Your body clears acetaldehyde with a second enzyme, and for most people that happens fast. But roughly a third of people from East Asian backgrounds carry a slow version of it, so it hangs around and they go red and blotchy after half a beer. That flush isn't a cute quirk. It's a toxin sitting in the system longer than it should, and those people carry a meaningfully higher esophageal cancer risk if they drink anyway. Everyone else gets the same chemical just without the light show. You're not spared, you just can't see it. There's a second track that has nothing to do with your liver. Alcohol loosens the junctions between the cells lining your gut, so bacterial fragments leak into your bloodstream more easily. Your immune system reads those fragments as an infection and starts a low-grade inflammatory response, the same background process sitting underneath most age-related disease. And when people are hungover, their blood shows a measurable spike in inflammatory signaling molecules that tracks with how rough they say they feel. Nobody has nailed down exactly which step causes which here, but the hangover clearly isn't just dehydration or brain chemistry rebounding. It reaches your sleep too, which for me was the most annoying discovery of all. Alcohol knocks you out fast, so it feels like the best sleep aid ever invented. But sedation isn't sleep. It suppresses REM in the first half of the night, then your body rebounds and fragments the second half with wake-ups you mostly don't remember. I tracked this myself with 2 glasses of wine at dinner, nothing dramatic, and my resting heart rate ran higher all night while my recovery scores sat in the basement. That was what actually changed my behavior, long before I understood any of the cancer data. Every one of those mechanisms scales with the dose, which is why regulators stopped trying to set a safe cutoff. A few years ago, the World Health Organization stated that when it comes to alcohol and cancer, no level of consumption is safe. People read that as activism, and I get why, because it sounds written to make you feel bad at a wedding, but it isn't a moral claim. It's a statement about where the evidence stops, and it never finds a threshold below which the cancer risk hits 0. It just gets smaller as the dose gets smaller, which is a very different sentence from the one everybody hears. Here's what that looks like with actual numbers, and I'll be honest rather than dramatic. For 1 drink a day, the extra lifetime cancer risk is real but modest, on the order of a percentage point or 2, running higher for women because of breast cancer. Nobody should quit drinking terrified of 1 glass. What changes the picture is that the line has no flat part at the bottom. Most other risks we talk about on this channel have a threshold where your body simply handles it. With ethanol, the curve just keeps sloping down towards 0 without ever touching it. The place where the dose response really shows up is the brain, and it's the study that got my attention more than the cancer filing did. Researchers looked at brain scans from tens of thousands of people in the UK Biobank and compared them against how much they drank. There was no plateau. People averaging a full glass of wine a day showed measurably less gray and white matter than people averaging half a glass, a gap that worked out to roughly 2 extra years of brain aging. Going from nothing to 1 drink a day did less damage than going from 1 to 2, which tells you the effect worsens with more drinking, not that the first one is free. Blood pressure behaves the same boring way, and you can watch this one in real time. Alcohol raises it. The effect stacks with regular drinking, and it shows up even in people who'd call themselves light drinkers. I saw it in my own morning readings during a stretch of wine 2 or 3 nights a week, and I remember being genuinely annoyed because I was doing everything else right. The zone 2 cardio, the sleep, the sodium and potassium balance. Then I'd undo a chunk of it on a Friday and call it a rest day. So no safe dose isn't telling you that 1 beer will kill you. It's telling you there's no amount, at which the biology switches off. That distinction matters because the old advice was built the other way around. It handed you a number, told you staying under it made you fine, and let you stop thinking. The honest version is less comfortable and much more useful. You're not choosing between safe and unsafe, you're choosing how much of a known toxin to run through your body and what you're getting back for it. So the dose only tells half the story, because frequency is the other half people never count. This is the part that actually changed how I think, and it has nothing to do with big numbers. Most of us mentally file drinking under events rather than habits. A wedding, a birthday, a Friday, a holiday, a work thing you couldn't get out of. Each one feels like an exception, so it never gets counted. And by the end of the year, you've drunk on something like 60 separate occasions. If you told me I was doing something to my liver and brain 60 times a year, I'd call that a habit. Call it a special occasion and it disappears from the ledger completely. The second half of that problem is repair time. And repair is always slower than damage. Damage happens over a few hours, while the ethanol and acetaldehyde move through you, rebuilding a cell membrane, patching the gut lining, resolving inflammation, and repairing DNA, all run on a much slower clock, some of it needing days rather than hours. So when the gap between drinks is shorter than the repair window, you're not starting from a clean baseline each time. You're stacking a new insult on tissue that hasn't finished healing, and the body's answer to repeated injury is usually scar tissue rather than new healthy cells. That scarring process is the one part of this I genuinely rather people understood over everything else. Your liver is famously good at regenerating, and that stays true right up until the repair crew starts laying down fibrous tissue instead of working cells. Fat in the liver comes and goes, and so does inflammation. Early scarring can still walk itself back if the drinking stops, which is the part nobody bothers to mention. Once it advances far enough to become cirrhosis though, it's architecture. And architecture doesn't unbuild itself. The whole staircase can run for years without a single symptom, which is exactly why people are shocked by their first bad scan. The same logic applies to the heart. And this is where the moderate drinker's mental model breaks. Alcohol is directly toxic to heart muscle cells, and years of heavy drinking can leave the chamber walls stretched and weaker at pumping. That's a heavy drinking story rather than an occasional wine one, and I'd rather be straight with you than sell you the worst case. The lighter version is far more ordinary. Alcohol leaves your heart rhythm more irritable for a day or two afterwards, which is why people notice palpitations after a party and blame the coffee. That invisibility is the whole reason this argument never lands at a dinner table. You can be doing all of this to yourself and look great in the mirror because the body is very good at running quietly on a smaller margin than it used to have. Nothing hurts. Your energy is fine, and the drinker you're comparing yourself to is a cartoon with a red nose and a paper bag. So you file yourself under normal and move on. The changes just quietly narrow the range of life you get later. Every time I bring this up, the same pushback shows up, and it leans on that invisibility because none of this feels real until later. The first is my grandfather, and I love this one because I've used it myself. He smoked, drank every day, and made it to 94. Good for him, honestly. The problem is, you only ever hear about that grandfather. Nobody mentions the neighbor who did the same things and died at 61, because that story doesn't work as an argument. Genetics really does hand a small number of people an unusually forgiving version of these enzymes, and betting your one body on being that person is a strange bet with no information. The second is quality, and it's pure marketing. Organic wine, natural wine, small batch mezcal, sulfite-free biodynamic, the bottle with a horse on it. Ethanol is ethanol, and your enzymes can't read the label. Quality only changes the concentration and the volume you're likely to drink, which matters a bit, but not for the reason anyone means. If anything, the good stuff is more dangerous socially, because it comes with a story that makes the evening feel like a cultural experience rather than a chemical one. The third hits closest to home for this audience. I train, sleep well, Eat properly, so surely I've got a buffer to absorb a few drinks. Fitness genuinely buys you resilience, and a well-trained person handles stress better than an untrained one. But it doesn't cancel the mechanism, it just delays when the consequences become visible, which is the worst combination. You get the damage on the same schedule and the warning signs on a delay. The fourth is stress, and it's the only one I take seriously. People say a drink is how they unwind, and the loneliness of not unwinding is a real health risk too. What I will say is that alcohol is a spectacularly bad tool for that job. It suppresses your stress hormones for a couple of hours, then they rebound higher than where they started, usually at 3 in the morning while you lie there wide awake. You're borrowing calm at a very poor interest rate, and you always pay it back the next day. I promised you this part, and I'd be a hypocrite if I skipped it. Some coverage of no safe dose slides into implying that one glass of champagne at a wedding is meaningfully shortening your life, and that isn't what the data says. Risk at very low intake is small in absolute terms. If you're sedentary, sleeping 5 hours and carrying a lot of visceral fat, your once-a-month beer isn't near the top of your problem list. The headline is directionally right, and the tone around it often isn't. There's a second caveat, and it cuts against my own argument. Almost everything we know about light drinking comes from watching populations rather than controlled trials, and it relies on people accurately reporting how much they drink, which they famously don't. People underreport, which actually works in my favor here because it means the damage attributed to 2 drinks was probably done by 3 or 4. It also means anyone quoting a precise risk figure for a specific number of glasses is dressing up an estimate as a measurement. So here's the framework I ended up with, and it isn't a rule about never drinking. The first question is what I'm actually buying with this drink. Sometimes the honest answer is a genuinely good evening with people I care about, and that's worth paying for. Far more often, the honest answer was that I felt awkward holding nothing, or it was Friday, and Friday apparently has a chemical requirement. Cutting those purchases took maybe 80% of my drinking away without any willpower at all. The second question is what the next 2 days look like. Alcohol wrecks the night's sleep and drags the following day's training, so a drink on Thursday quietly cost me Friday's session and most of Saturday's energy. Once I started pricing it that way, the trade got a lot easier to refuse, because I was comparing it against 2 days I'd already decided mattered more. That reframe did more for me than any statistic in this video. The third is purely practical. Have your answer ready before anyone asks, because the pressure at a table is never about the alcohol, it's about not wanting to explain yourself. I say I'm driving, or that I've got an early start, and the conversation moves on in seconds. And if you take medication of any kind, that's a conversation for your own doctor, not for a table full of relatives, because plenty of ordinary prescriptions interact with alcohol in ways people never check. The question I get more than any other is whether any of this is reversible. The real answer sits in between yes and no, and it's more encouraging than the internet lets on. Repair runs on a slower clock than damage, so nobody wakes up with a factory fresh liver after a dry weekend. But the body is genuinely good at walking things back once you stop handing it new work, and the order things recover and surprised me when I went through it myself. The fast wins land in the first couple of weeks. Sleep architecture starts normalizing within days once sedation stops fragmenting the second half of the night. My resting heart rate dropped noticeably inside a week, and my recovery scores stopped looking like I'd been in a fight every Saturday. Blood pressure responds on a similar timeline, with meaningful drops inside roughly a month. Fat in the liver clears quickly too, and that's usually the first thing a doctor sees change. The slower layer takes months rather than weeks. The gut lining rebuilds, and the low-grade inflammation settles down over weeks to months rather than overnight. Brain volume is the one that genuinely shocked me, because some of the shrinkage does appear to partially reverse in people who stop, especially in the first year. Fibrosis is the exception I keep coming back to. Early scarring can improve once the injury stops, but advanced scarring is architecture, and that part stays. I haven't sworn off alcohol forever, and I'm not gonna tell you that you have to. But I've stopped treating it as neutral, and that shift alone changed how often I reach for it. The drink at a wedding toast or my mom's birthday dinner is a conscious trade I'm making with open eyes, not a habit I've talked myself into believing is healthy. The weekly glass of wine because it's Friday, the beer because the game's on, the round because everyone else ordered one. That's the pattern I cut, because that's where the damage actually accumulates. That's the actual takeaway here. Not fear, just information you can use to make your own call about your own one life. If this changed how you think about your next glass, or if you think I'm overselling the risk, tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you want to see what happened when I pulled alcohol out of my routine for a month, that experiment's on this channel too.